we will try and see briefly what was the context in which Indian philosophy developed, what were the various phases or conceptual phases of development of Indian philosophy, and finally what are some of its unique features. Now if you see, as I started the session, we said that we are in the quest of ultimate happiness. So always the center of the inquiry is the self. So the jiva, which is the Sanskrit word for the self, is always at the center of the inquiry. But this jiva does not occur in an isolated environment. The jiva is always in society or in this world. So that is Jagat. So the jiva is in the Jagat. And so that forms the larger context of philosophical development in the Indian scenario. But then when the philosophical quest continues, it always leads to some sort of ultimate entity like God, which is called variously as Ishvara, God, or Brahman, or something like that. We have put a general label for that called Ishvara. So these three things, Jiva, Jagat and Ishvara, form the philosophical context or the background context in which all philosophical ideas were developed. But the development in which the philosophical ideas came about has a certain different order. But in their quest to seek the ultimate response, the early human beings, when they started out their inquiry about this ultimate happiness, they always looked outside. They always looked to the Jagat. They thought that the answer we will get from the world outside. So the first inquiry started from examining the Jagat, asking about the nature of Jagat. So in the Rig Veda, there is, in the 10th mandala, you will find a very interesting sukta called the Nasadiya Sukta. This tries to understand what is the nature of this world, where this world came into existence from. There was neither existence nor were there non-existence. That is why it is called Nasadiya Sukta. So in that, it tries to first understand, the Vedic philosopher tries to understand first the nature of Jagat. And a lot of inquiry at that time was focused on the nature of Jagat, to understand the nature of the world. But then they realized that no, something is happening over here. The various entities like rainfall, the monsoon, or the wind, the sun, etc., they seem to be going in some regulated fashion. There must be some entity which is regulating all of these natural phenomena or the phenomena that occurs in the Jagat. So they posited some divine entity. In the Vedic time it was called Deva. I am just using it as a metaphor for this Ishvara. So they posited some divine entities in order to explain this natural phenomena. So they first started asking questions about Jagat. From that, the inquiry shifted to this thing called Deva or Ishvara, and they started understanding or trying to understand the nature of the Deva. What is the nature of this divine entity which regulates everything? Sometimes this divine entity was a person like say Indra, Varuna, etc., or sometimes it was some abstract principle like Rita, which is the cosmic order which regulates all the things that go on in the Jagat. So for a long time they spent their time trying to understand the nature of this divine entity. But then they realized that there is something still wrong over here. As long as we keep looking outside or to other things, we will not be able to find internal or happiness for the jiva. So then the focus shifted to the jiva. So even though the context of philosophical development, we say jiva, Jagat and Ishvara, the development happened in some other way. First it was the inquiry into the Jagat, then it was an inquiry into the Ishvara or the Deva or the divine entity, and then finally it came to the inquiry of the self. So they realized that if we want ultimate happiness, we have to find out the nature of self. So this is very beautifully captured in one of the mantras in the Kathopanishad, which says Paranchikani Vyatirin Swayambhuhu. Purusha, or the person who created us, that person made all our senses to go outward, right? So that is why we always start to seek answers to the questions of our life by looking outward. But then Kaschid Dhiraha, so some wise person comes understanding that no, the answers cannot be found by looking outside. We have to start looking inside. So they shift their gaze inward. So Amritatvam Ichat, by seeking infinite happiness or see that infinite bliss, because of the desire for that infinite bliss, they start seeing inward, they start seeing inside. So a quest for ultimate happiness begins by asking questions about the external world, but eventually the wise person start seeing inside. So this is the brief conceptual development of philosophical ideas in the Indian context. First look at the external world, then start asking questions about the divine, and then finally come to the enquiry about self. So this was about the development of Indian philosophy. Depending upon, that does not mean that all philosophical traditions in India search only for answers to the self. It is not the case. So different traditions have focused on different aspects of this context. So for example, there are certain theistic darshanas which focus more on Ishvara, like say the theistic Vedantas like Vishishtadvaita Vedanta or Dvaita Vedanta, where God is very important, prayer to God is very important. Same in the case of Shaiva darshanas also, prayer is very important or religious activity is very important. There are some darshanas which focus more on Jagat or the external world, like say the Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Jaina also for that matter focuses a lot on the explaining the material world outside. But there are certain other schools which focus exclusively or almost exclusively on the Jiva or the nature of the self. For example, Advaita Vedanta, Bauddha and Yoga for example focus more on the self. So all of these traditions have something to say about all the three, Jiva, Jagat as well as Ishvara, but their focus is on something else. So the theistic Vedantas for example focus more on the Jiva and the Ishvara, whereas the Nyaya Vaisheshika focus on the Jagat. In this way their focus changes.